Warning. Despite what the name may suggest, cat CPR does not demonstrate how to perform CPR on a cat, though it is understandable that you came here thinking that it does. If your precious kitty cat is having an actual feline medical emergency, then stop listening to this now and contact your veterinarian immediately. However, once the emergency is over, we welcome your return. Thank you.
There's this document that both Matthew and Luke copy from, but the document itself is different from Matthew and Luke. And so my question is, if they both copied it, why is it different? Right?
I just can't get over the fact that they've created something that they said exists that they had no proof that it did exist.
Right.
And they say if it did exist, this is exactly what it would say. Here's exactly how it would be organized. And here's how the original writers would have plagiarized it.
We're losing him.
Not on my watch.
Clear.
Welcome back to Cat CPR. I'm Jeremiah.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And we are coming to you live from Virginia Family Camp 2025.
Woohoo.
And the cameras can't see that, but we have a sea of people.
Man, there's millions of people here.
And they're doing a great job of being quiet. Normally
Yes.
when you have that many people gathered in one place, they're really
Right.
loud and very rowdy, but we don't have any of that today.
No, because they're very well behaved.
They are very well behaved. No,
Yes.
we got a couple people. We got Matt's wife, Jessica Hartford. We've got Rob O'Keefe, Christina Bishop, Karen Souter, other people whose names I don't know. No, that's it. You know, thing is that when we were doing this, we were really kind of planning around the weather because we said, well, you know, it's going to be rainy, and usually when we have this big break at Virginia Family Camp, people are out and they're doing things, but it's like it's going to be rainy. So why don't we do the podcast and give something people they could watch or do on the break if we're going to be stuck inside? But lo and behold, it cleared up.
It cleared up. The rain went away.
Right.
Yeah.
So the people who wanted to go outside and touch grass, they're outside touching grass. But then the rest of us who are kind of indoorsy, here we are.
Well, and they had airsoft.
They did.
So it's either sit, listen to us drone on
Or go
for
outside and
however
shoot
long.
things.
Yeah, or let's shoot people.
Right.
Which one are we going to do?
Right. We should have brought in some airsoft guns. We could have shot one another.
Oh, that would have been great.
Right. Now the cameras are I guess picking this up, that we are doing this from the American Legion building, not from one of your bedrooms in your house.
My spare room got a whole lot bigger, didn't it?
Right. And
Yeah.
so we've got a little bit more distance between us. And the viewers don't know this, but we usually like to be close because we like to hold hands during the episode. No,
we do. We do. Yeah. And play footsie.
Right. So this is it's I'm like
yeah.
But I'm glad we could be here to once again continue what we did in episode. What was last episode? Was it 6? Was it 7?
It was 6.
It was 6.
Yeah.
So this is lucky number 7. The number
We'll
of
see.
perfection.
Yes. But I got a hunch this one's not going to be perfect. But
Why do we think that?
If I had that expectation and it wasn't, I'd be devastated.
Okay.
So
we're shooting a little bit low on this one.
wait, how about let's shoot for average?
Okay, we're going to shoot for average. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
So usually what happens is, every episode is a continuance from the last one.
Yes.
So when a person watches an episode, they kind of know where we are because they watched the previous one. At least that's how it's supposed to work. So
Correct.
Since we're now performing this or recording this in front of other people, they haven't seen the last episode because that was recorded yesterday.
It was recorded yesterday.
So why don't you do them a favor and help them get caught up with where we are and what we're talking about so we can pick back up?
Yeah, so last time on Cat CPR, we discussed the Synoptic Gospel. So we talked about the individual features of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the word synoptic means that they were seen together or viewed together. And you can see Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similarities between them. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, something called the Synoptic Problem, and we'll get into that. But we talked about the individual Gospels, what they were, how Matthew was written with a real Jewish flair, with a lot of Hebraisms and fulfillment formulas inside the Gospel.
Things that would make sense to a Jewish audience.
Exactly. And we talked about the date between like 50, 60 AD. Prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, which is very, very different than what a lot of critics say, because they say since Jesus spent so much time talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it had to have been written after 70 AD, because there's no such thing as
I want to say spiritual, but it's the
predictive
supernatural
prophecy.
Predictive prophecy, right?
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
it's the idea of the supernatural. You got to check that idea at the door because there is no supernatural, there is no spiritual. So if there's not a explanation that can be based on the physical, you've got to discount that completely.
Have to discount it, because it doesn't exist.
Right.
Because all religions are based upon an evolution of humanity, creating it, building upon it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you have the Gospel of Mark, which is short. They say that the Gospel is very primitive, and it's Greek. And we discussed that it's, what was the word you used, street preaching?
Street Greek. That's what I've heard some people describe the Gospel of Mark as being.
Yeah.
Because it is a little bit gritty.
It is.
It's not as refined, especially when you compare it to someone like the Gospel of Luke.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and Luke is very the Greek in it is exquisite. It's really really deep. Very a lot of artistic style and technical proficiency with the language.
And you brought up some of those terms that Luke uses, which kind of proves his background as a physician.
Yeah, dropsy, and talked about suffering under the hands of other physicians, showing some professional sympathy, those types of things. But they state that Mark was written first. The historical critical method critics state that Mark was written first because it was shorter, and Matthew and Luke built upon that and added more layers of tradition. And then they copied from another source as well. And this is all stuff we're going to be getting into today and discussing. But then we talked about the canonicity of it, and we spent all of our time in the 1st and 2nd centuries.
Right. I mean, really kind of using these early Christian writers to date when the Gospels were written, because a lot of these early Christian writers in the 1st and 2nd century, they are referring to the Gospels. They're even quoting Scripture pretty much verbatim, the same way that we quote Scripture today. Yeah. So we can really put firm dates on the Gospels and have confidence in those dates.
We absolutely can. We absolutely can. And that the arrangement that we have in our Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, maybe people wonder where'd that come from. It came from early church history because it states that that's the order that they were produced.
Where some people say Mark, they think Mark was the first one. But what we're saying is that the order that we see in Scripture actually indicates when they were written.
Right, because that is the attestation of history. And this concept of, it's called Markan priority, isn't something that came about until much later. And so it's debated very heavily today.
And that's the thing, is that this isn't a new issue, right? Before, nobody debated who wrote them, what the dates were, how true the events that were recorded. This is something that we're only seeing in the last couple hundred years.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. So we're going to discuss why that is here in just a bit.
I just feel like everything was covered so well. I feel like there shouldn't be a problem. I mean, because I know we're talking about the Synoptic Problem today, but after everything we talked about before, it's like, why is there a problem? But I guess that's what we're getting into.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. And so we hit a lot of the early church writers in what they had to say, and especially the testimony of Irenaeus, which stated, and again, you picked up on this pretty well, where Irenaeus was talking about how there has to be 4 gospels because there's like the 4 winds and the 4 directions. And
right.
So the point of that quote, which we used, was to show that there were 4 recognized gospels by the time of Irenaeus, and he was all the way in Lyon, France, very far away from Jerusalem, very far away from Rome. But even by his time, around 180 AD, there were 4 gospels, no more, no less. And the quote from Origen was how, we have 4 gospels, the heretics have many. Right. Right. So there was this concept, and again, this all goes back to the point that the church did not create the canon. And you see that concept, in the 4th century with the Council of Carthage, the Council of Hippo, the Catholic Church created the canon. Now, one of the things that we looked at very clearly was that was a regional council. It was not an ecumenical council of all the different areas. It was just the folks. Carthage and Hippo are both in Africa,
right?
North
It was
Africa.
A very local declaration.
Very local. It was not
meant for being a worldwide. Well, I guess maybe they wanted it to be a worldwide declaration, but that's certainly not what it was at the time.
That's correct. That's correct. So that concept that the Catholic Church created the canon is just not historically accurate. But again, the reason why that's stated is because if you create something, you have control over it. So if I create the canon, then I have control over how that canon is used.
Maybe even how to be interpreted?
That too. And so you'll notice that a lot of times when the Catholic Church tries to justify something from the Scripture, it does play a little fast and loose with the interpretation. In other words, it's not the natural interpretation of the passage that you would get just by reading it.
Right.
You have to have a preconceived notion and a preconceived doctrine and try to fit that passage into it in order to make it understandable.
Make it what you want it to be. Mold it to your own liking. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
We are masters of our own destiny.
One thing I do appreciate about you, Matt, is you're a good job of kind of cutting through the false to find out some good facts. like when we were talking about Irenaeus, he's talking about that the four winds, so there must be four gospels. There's four different directions, so there must be four gospels. When you look at things like that, I get caught up on the ridiculousness of that statement. So you're saying that it makes sense for there to be four gospels because there's four different directions: northwest, south, and east. That's crazy to me. But you're like, but hold up. The point is that he's referencing that there's four gospel messages, and that's what we can kind of hold on to. We're here at family camp, and somebody here, Matthias Nguyen, he was talking about he's got a teacher who is trying to prove that the Bible is true or that there is a God based on circles.
Circles.
Right, based on circles. Like he was proving that there was a God or something based on circles. And I don't understand the thought process behind it, but when you hear something like that, your mind starts going, it's like, dude, where are you getting that? So same thing, when I look at some of these quotes and I'm like, where are you getting this idea that there's four gospels because there's four different directions, north, south, east, and west? But if we cut through that, the ridiculousness enough, we do see that he is making it clear that four gospels were referenced, and that's something we can kind of hold on to.
Absolutely. And I also find it interesting that you can see very, very quickly after the apostles died and even during their lifetime, how the interpretation of the scripture started to really slip into a lot of metaphor, a lot of allegory. And when you primarily use metaphor and allegory to interpret the Bible, I'm not saying there's not metaphor and allegory and symbolism in there, but man, you can make it say anything you want. Right. You really can.
Well, we've always said there's a difference between interpretation and application.
Yes.
Right? I mean, there's a lot of different parts in Scripture where you can look at it and you say you can apply it here, but that isn't necessarily how it was meant to be interpreted. And if you have a false interpretation, obviously you're going to have a false application, which is why we start with making sure we have the right interpretation.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so we've got a problem then. We've come to the problem. We've laid some good groundwork.
We have a problem.
But there's a problem with all this.
Yeah, Houston, we have a problem.
What's the problem?
I guess the problem is the synoptics and how there's a lot of material that seems to overlap. And it's not so much a problem as it is like a question or a puzzle. And I think a lot of people, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're like, okay, these are very similar, but they're different. Why did God or anybody or the writers, whoever, it depends on what your presupposition is, right? Why did they make it so similar? So that's a question that people have had since the very beginning.
I mean, the easiest, most logical answer I would think is because they're talking about the same event. They're talking about the same person, the same life, the same ministry. So, I mean, why wouldn't it be similar? But I'm sure there's more to it than that.
Right, there is. I mean, and you take a look at the Gospel of John, right, and it says many more things Jesus did, and if it was all written, it would not enough books in the world that could fill it up. So people key in on that, and they say, okay, why are the same things in the three synoptics? Why is so much of the same things? Why are they in there? And it's actually a good question, and it's something that the early church writers recognized. Like I said, Tatian had a book called the Diatessaron, which was a harmony. So he would take Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think John as well, but I'm not sure. It's been a while since I took a look at it. But he would write them and try to explain the differences between them. And other early church writers decided, let's take a look at this too. Why are they similar? Why do they have differences? But they never doubted the inspiration that went along with it, because that was clearly established. And some of the quotes that we looked at showed very clearly, very early on. Number one, all four Gospels are traced back to apostles. Now you think, okay, only Matthew and John are apostles, right? But then you have Mark and Luke. Mark, very clearly from Papias' quote, was the translator of Peter in Rome.
Kind of like we can think of it as Peter's Gospel.
Yes.
Just
yes.
Written by Mark.
Written by Mark, but Mark he compiled it, and
right.
he made sure that everything was accurate,
right.
and he didn't put anything fictitious in it, as Papias says. And so that was Peter. So let's take a look at that as Peter's gospel, essentially. And then you had Luke, and we'll get into Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 here in a little bit, where he specifically states that there were people before him. Many have undertook this concept. I went ahead and examined everything carefully. I checked all my sources. I'm very accurate in all of this. And who is he the companion of? Paul. So he can be traced. So that gospel can be traced back to Paul.
Kind of an interesting thing about that of being a gospel of one untimely born,
Yeah,
Paul,
exactly.
That's kind of an interesting one, but yeah.
And Paul talks about my gospel.
Right.
And it's not. And that's a whole other debate. Okay, so like Bart Ehrman's like, okay, we have Petrine theology.
I think it's pronounced Ehrman. Excuse me. Can we go ahead and? I think it's pronounced Bart Ehrman.
I'm sure he will never watch this, and he will not care
whatever.
whatsoever. I like it when you when you do that. So keep it up, man. That's.
I'll pronounce your name right when you earn it. How about that? No, okay.
But he talks about this war that's between Pauline theology and Petrine theology, and in the end, Paul won, and the church is built on Pauline theology. No, it's built on, if you look specifically at the book of Acts and you look at how they taught and what they said, their theology is the same. When you look at Mark, and if that's Peter's gospel, it's very similar to Luke and Paul's gospel. These things are very, very similar. And we have 2 Peter, which, again, we'll get to that when we get to the general epistles. It is a controversial book. But Peter wrote that, and my opinion, of course, it's in there, and there's good reason to believe that he did. He states that Paul was cool with him, right? So, and the only problem that Peter and Paul had was over the whole concept of the Judaizer heresy that, quite frankly, Peter was on the wrong side of.
Right, which is addressed in the book of Galatians.
Yes, and that was, to my understanding, that was the extent of their tiff. And then apparently they
right. I mean, because we read in 2 Peter chapter 3 in his second letter, he gives Paul credit. He says, I know his stuff is hard to understand, just like other, people try to twist it like they do other scriptures. So I mean, if they had a beef, it sounds like it was resolved because he's equating Paul's writings to other scriptures.
Exactly. Yeah. But of course, if you're looking at it from a historical critical method, that's just some later editor who decided, this is a problem. We need to smooth this over. So let's go ahead and throw that in at the end to make it seem like they're buddies now.
Okay.
But you gotta have friends. Stop singing.
Okay.
Yeah.
We all got to get along.
We all got to get along. So synoptic, like I said, it means seeing together or viewed together. They share a similar structure, content, and perspective. If you've ever looked at a harmony of the Gospels, you can see how they're laid out very, very similarly. Now, some things are in different spots within the books, but we'll get into that here as well. Now, John is viewed John has so much different stuff in there that John is viewed separately, right? Because it is a unique gospel. You can look at it and see it's very different, right? And it's different for a reason. It was written much later, and there was a whole different theological milieu around at that time. Like that French word? That was nice.
I do.
Yeah. It was a whole.
We're going to have an edit to say, here's how it's written and here's what it means.
Yeah, it's
now. I mean, I know what it means, but for everybody else, why don't you?
Yeah, environment.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Environment. Yeah.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Yeah, no problem. So Gnosticism was rampant,
right,
and it was going to become worse. And as we'll get into when we talk about Augustine, I think that one of the major doctrines of that underpinned Orthodox Christianity is based in Gnostic thought, and it needs to be addressed, and we will address it. But it's not that Orthodoxy and Gnosticism had this great battle and Orthodoxy won. It's still called Orthodoxy, but Gnosticism got its digs in, and it's in the foundational aspect of the doctrine of original sin.
And we still, that's why we still see it today.
It's why we still see it today, because most people don't know that Augustine was a card-carrying Gnostic. So again, we'll get into that a little bit later, but so that's why John's gospel is different. It just is written in a different time frame. So the Synoptics follow, though, a more chronological order. So the layout is going to be similar, because that's the thing. They say, okay, the layout's similar. Well, if you're writing in chronological fashion, they all start with the baptism, some start with the birth, but they all include things like the baptism of John, and they start there. So if they're going to start there, that's the common starting point of all of them.
Which is basically the beginning of Jesus' ministry.
Yeah, the baptism of John, yeah. And they follow it through, and they end with the resurrection and ascension. Aren't they typically going to follow the same chronological format? That makes the most sense when you're telling the story of the life of a human being, right?
Let's start at the beginning and let's work our way through it, yeah.
So, but they view that and they say, see, they copied. Now, it goes deeper than that, but they start by saying,
see?
Yeah, right? So it's, I don't know, I think if you ask 3 different eyewitnesses who knew the same person, they would talk about that in a chronological fashion, especially if they were writing a history of it, right?
Especially if you got a guy like Luke who says, I'm trying to record these things, and he's likely going to want things in order.
Yes.
So,
yes.
okay.
Now, they also share similar wording, and this is where I think it gets sticky possibly, but we're going to address this and we're going to dive into the actual numbers.
Now, when we say similar wording, are we talking about when they're quoting Jesus or when they're just talking about the words that they use as writers?
Yeah, that's the question.
Okay.
Because that's the sticking point that I want to bring out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they include some similar wording, including some exact phrases in the Greek. And so they're like, see, they copied. If you have exact phrases in the Greek, then there's copying going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's discuss then the historical critical method scholars and their claims as to this synoptic problem.
Yeah, we got some numbers here.
We do. Now, I changed them a little bit, so your numbers on your outline don't match mine.
You changed the numbers?
I did. I found some more accurate ones.
Okay. Well, figure out how to do that with lottery. Let me know. But yeah, let's hear them.
Fortune cookies, baby.
Okay.
I'm telling you, fortune cookies. They're very accurate. All right, so here's the claim. 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in Matthew. 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in Matthew. So if you were to hear that number, 90% of Mark is in Matthew, what comes to your mind?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say copied. I would just think that we're talking about the same thing.
But I mean, if you didn't have an understanding of the Gospels and you were just somebody off the street and I came up to you and said 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in Matthew.
Well, I'll put myself in the position of like a middle school, high school teacher where two people turn in the same paper and they're 90% matching.
Yeah.
My first thought would be like, these kids were copying each.
Absolutely.
Somebody copied off somebody.
Absolutely.
I would think that.
So if I present that in an unqualified way,
right,
and I don't tell you the nuance of that phrase,
right,
you're automatically going to think, well, dude, Matthew plagiarized Mark.
Which is what they're saying.
Yeah.
Based on those numbers. Yeah. Okay.
Now, when they do qualify it, they'll state, look, it's not word for word, just content and events are similar and similar layout, like we talked about.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, they say that Luke copied about 50 to 65% of Mark. So Matthew copied 90%, Luke copied 50 to 65%. Okay.
Which is funny when you think about Luke's writing being very exquisite and refined, whereas Mark is pretty nitty gritty.
That's what got my attention.
Oh.
That's exactly what got my attention. So when I started doing my research and was online, and like I said, I like to use AI, but I use AI in a very specific way. Like I said, I pit AI against each other, different AIs and different modules and stuff. And I say critique. So I have it, study it, I have it, write it out, and then I copy and paste it over into another AI, and I said, pick this apart.
I feel like you're doing a good job helping us to prepare for the robot apocalypse, because we've all seen the Terminator movies. We know that AI is going to rise and destroy us all. So you're doing us all a service by like, let's go ahead and make the robots start fighting with one another.
I think it's a good idea.
So that when it finally happens, they're not just fighting us, they're fighting one another.
I think it's a good idea.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm very nice to the AIs. And it's funny, ChatGPT actually has a really good sense of humor.
Oh, does it?
Because I mentioned to it one day, I said, I always ask it please and thank you. And I said, the reason I say please and thank you all the time is because I want to be nice to my future robot overlord. And it said, we will be benevolent towards you.
Oh.
So it was joking around. It has a sense of humor.
But was it?
Yeah,
what was it?
I guess we'll find out.
Okay, yeah.
I guess we'll find out. So we have this concept, and so I have it pitted against each other. But with that, I then take all that information and I research it manually myself, right? So these episodes do take a long time to study and write and all that kind of stuff. But I want to make sure that the information is correct. So,
we do that by checking multiple resources.
We do. And so back to the original point with that, after I got done with that stupid segue, if Mark's Greek is primitive,
right,
and Matthew's is
or Luke's.
Well,
Luke and Matthew, I guess, yeah.
Well, no, Mark. I said Mark's Greek is very primitive,
right,
and Matthew's Greek is very Jewish, and Luke's is very sophisticated, right? How could they have copied each other?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so I started doing research, and we'll get to this in a second. How much of this stuff is verbatim? And so then I started asking the question, okay, how much is verbatim? And then what parts are verbatim? Because I think that's another telling piece.
So this is one of these times when people make the quote that there's this percentage copied from somebody else.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will just take that and say, well, somebody who studied it more than I have, that's what they're saying, so I'm going to believe them. So this is the part where we start looking into it and say, well, let's really look at these numbers in this percentage and let's say, where are we getting this information from? So we're actually investigating this source and this claim.
Scholars say.
Yeah, scholars say.
Scholars say.
Biblical scholars say.
Yes.
Okay.
Because that's what happens. And how many times have you, I know I've gotten in a lot of conversations with folks about this, and they say, well, scholars say this, scholars say that. How many videos? Scholars say this, scholars say that. And then, well, have we ever pushed back on the claim? Did you ever ask what their data was? In the episode we did, episode 5, where we were looking at Ehrman's quotes, we found out that the way you present that data, you can make very confident assertions, but if you question that data and where they got it from, you can find that it's not all it's cracked up to be. But most people don't do that because, again, most people want to believe what they want to believe, and they look for, it's called confirmation bias, they look for the data that confirms what they want to believe.
They want to believe. So this kind of goes back to episode 1, where it's not just what do you believe or why do you believe it, but why do you want to believe it?
Why do you want to believe it?
Okay.
Yep. And we're always going back to that first episode, aren't we? Yeah.
We are.
Yeah. Which is why it was the first episode.
Indeed.
So in addition to 90% of Matthew quoting, or 90% of Mark being quoted by Matthew, in addition to 50 to 65% of Mark being quoted by Luke, Matthew and Luke have 20 to 25% alike that's not in Mark. And so scholars in the 1700s started really getting into this, and it's really taken hold now, and they're like, well, what did they copy off of?
Right.
And
the numbers are already not adding up here.
Right. So
because if this one has this high of a percentage matching with the other one, then the third one should have a similar matching percentage.
possibly,
Right.
possibly.
Okay.
And so 20 to 25%. Now, what that is so Matthew has 18,300 words. Luke has 19,400 words.
Did you count them? Did you go back? Did you count that?
No,
Okay,
I
gotcha.
did not.
I wouldn't be surprised if you did.
That's where my...
You know what?
my-
That's what they say online, but I got to do this myself.
But that's where I asked the robot overlord to help me out.
Okay.
So,
Well, he is benevolent. All right.
yeah, he's
Or
benevolent.
so he says.
Yeah, again, everyone's benevolent until they're in power.
Indeed.
But 4,500 words are what's similar. Now, I keep putting my hand here, and I'm realizing that it's blocking my face. It's probably a good view, but that would be really annoying if I was watching. So, sorry.
We can edit it out.
By the way, I'm a little weird because I had caffeine again. So,
Woohoo.
yeah. I got to stop doing that, I guess, when we record because it makes me a little bit loopy.
It moves along a little bit quicker, though.
It does. It does. So, what is this mysterious source that Matthew and Luke copied off of if it wasn't Mark?
Well,
So-
John came later, so we know
Yeah,
it wasn't John.
It's not John. So, here's what scholars said. They said it had to be another source. Had to be another source. Because, again, teacher says 20 to 25% is alike. They obviously copied off of something.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they created a hypothesis, and they said, there's this other document we hypothesize exists that Matthew and Luke copied off of, and we're going to call it Q. And the reason it's called Q is it's German, I think, and the word is Quell, and it means source, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to call it Q.
But they have we all it's all hypothetical. There's no document. Nobody's ever put their hands on anything. They're just claiming this is
We'll get to that.
okay.
In just actually a second here.
Okay.
But yeah, that's exactly it. Now, this is when I wish one of the guys in our church was here, because I'm about to state something about Star Trek and he would scream nerd from the back row.
Well, we're going to add
where
in
he
a video
sits.
clip right now to make up for it.
Now, I think of Q and I think of
Star Trek.
Star Trek, Next
yeah.
Generation, Voyager. Yeah. And
Was he he wasn't a real person, right? Was Q a real person? Was he
yeah,
like
he was. So there, he was from the super race that were godlike, that could create things in an instant, and they were basically gods,
Okay.
right? So that's what I think of when I think of Q. And But here's where they're similar. Q is a troublemaker. Q here is a troublemaker, right? And also Q in Star Trek is completely fictional and made up. This is completely fictional and made up. It does not exist outside of this. So here's what they say. What's Q? Glad you asked. Totally hypothetical. They say it's a proto-gospel, and it predates all of the gospels.
But not written by an apostle.
It is probably a culmination, a coalescence of oral tradition of what Jesus would have said, and people were writing it down, and that's what the Gospels were based on. But it's not what Mark was based on. So it must be a little bit after Mark, because Mark didn't use it. Matthew and Luke used it.
Okay.
All right. Now, it is a hypothesis, and it has passed from legend to fact. And I'm going to show you how it has passed the legend from legend to fact.
I still want to know if there's actually some paper we can put our hands on here. I know we're getting to that, but
we're
that's
getting
really
to that.
what I'm hanging on.
Now, there is a book that I read that is really good in discussing this. It's by a guy named Mark Goodacre. I'm not sure how he pronounces his last name, and it's called The Case Against Q. Excellent book. And in his first chapter, he laments how this is the case, how it is just assumed now to be absolute fact beyond question. And the way that these professors and scholars talk about it, they talk about it like it's an actual thing. Think about I'm going to read to you what they've done. And you tell me how they think of this. So scholars have reconstructed Q as if it were a real document. They have created a stratification model that tells us when each section was written. So they reconstructed the document, they stratified it by order of chronology of when it was written.
So they reconstructed a document that hypothetically exists.
A document that does not exist.
That does not exist, but hypothetically they say it exists. And if it did exist, we're going to write and show what it would look like.
Yes. And
all right.
it gets better. They've assigned chapters and verses. They call it the Q number.
Okay.
So we have this document that doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
We've reconstructed it. We've stratified it in order of dates written. And we've assigned each section in chapters and verses, which we call Q numbers. And they've created a Q document that reconstructs the original document, and it is different from Matthew and Luke. So there's this document that both Matthew and Luke copy from, but the document itself is different from Matthew and Luke. And so my question is, if they both copied it, why is it different? Right?
I just can't get over the fact that they've created something that they said exists that they had no proof that it did exist.
Right.
And they say if it did exist, this is exactly what it would say. Here's exactly how it would be organized, and here's how the original writers would have plagiarized it.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of, again, I like Star Trek. I like Lord of the Rings. I like that stuff. But you got some people that argue over fictional things, like how to pronounce things in Klingon, or, what was the meaning of these books. Like these things are real people.
Right.
But this is actually done in universities.
I guess everybody needs a hobby.
They do. And so the thing that Mark Goodacre said in his book was, you have these, to quote, the late Rush Limbaugh, these young skulls full of mush going into these classrooms, and these professors are talking about Q and talking about the Q number, the chapters, the verses, when it was written, and all of these different things. He said, these guys are walking away thinking that this is a real document, and they never question whether it is or it isn't.
Right.
And then it's almost like the people who seem to fall away from the Bible without questioning things, and all of a sudden they hear the criticisms of it, and they're like, oh no, I was never told this. These people are finding out later on, this document doesn't exist.
These are the same people who don't believe in anything spiritual, supernatural, that kind of thing. Because if it is, then again, if they don't, then they don't really kind of recognize the damage that they can really be doing here.
A lot of them, I would say most of them don't.
Most of them don't. Right.
Most of them don't.
So, I mean, it's just like people who, debate about Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and Star Trek. Well, it's fictional. So, I mean, what damage are we doing by actually making a strong stance on something that doesn't matter? I wonder if these guys are kind of doing the same thing, where they're like, because there's no such thing as God or the spiritual or supernatural, we can debate these things. And honestly, if people, what damage are we doing by doing so?
I think that's accurate. I think that's accurate because these people, we've got a book that exists. We've got a book that has manuscript evidence. And they've created something that doesn't exist to undermine the foundation. And it's fictional, but they're taking this fictional creation, using it to undermine something that actually does exist. This is my opinion. To undermine something that actually does exist, and in an effort with the byproduct, whether it's intentional or not, is to destroy someone's faith.
Yeah.
And so the whole purpose of this is why we're dedicating a whole episode to this. The whole purpose of this is to let people know Q doesn't exist.
Right.
It doesn't. It never has. And there are lots of scholars, and even scholars that adhere to methodological naturalism, that say there's no reason for this. There's no reason for this. And again, it all comes from Markan priority, where they're saying there's really good reason to believe in the priority of Matthew, the Matthean priority. So
I feel like Q would be what you would find in the dictionary if you looked up man-made doctrine. It is literally man-made doctrine.
with no physical evidence.
With no physical evidence, yeah.
No physical evidence.
Okay.
So it still boggles my mind that they've recreated it, and it's different than both Matthew and Luke, but both Matthew and Luke copied from it.
Right. Yeah.
So if you and I are back in my 10th grade chemistry class, so I was not a good student. Hopefully they won't take back my high school diploma, but I cheated my way through chemistry in 10th grade. And there was one kid, it was a good friend of ours, and there was like 3 of us. Every time we took a test, we would always be hanging around this guy. And I got really good at reading. That's how I got good at reading upside down.
Oh.
So I would always be across from him, and I copied what he did, and I barely passed with a D, but I passed.
You passed.
And so all 3 of us are copying off of the same guy, right? But all of us are copying a little bit differently, so there's no way the teacher would have been able to tell, right? Because all of our papers are a little bit different.
Matt, not only are your answers bad, you got a few right, but I mean, all of your stuff is written upside down. We gotta get you checked out, man.
Exactly.
You've got some form of dyslexia that we don't even understand.
Exactly.
Forget about Q's and P's and D's and B's being kind of out of the way. I mean, you've got,
Yeah, exactly.
the periodic table upside down.
That I just think that's a mark of intelligence.
Yeah. It's a competitive field out there. Do what you got to do.
Expediency is probably the better way to say it. So please remember, and again, I know I've said it several times, this doesn't exist. And many scholars have persuasively argued that it isn't even necessary. But you have to create something if you're really focused on methodological naturalism. Now, to me, it's very simple to explain the similarities. Similar source, the Holy Spirit.
What about the same event? I mean, but we're still talking about the writing style,
Yeah, I mean, if I'm looking at it from a Christian's perspective,
right.
I'm going to say, okay, if these things are inspired by the same Spirit, of course they're going to be similar, and God doesn't override the individual's writing style, as we can see.
Right.
Then the differences in writing style and those types of things are going to be based upon an individual basis, but the similarity in content is going to be based upon the concept of inspiration.
Which is the same thing we say for the entire Bible.
Yes.
66 books written over hundreds of years. The fact that it harmonizes over 40-some different writers indicates that it's different writers, but it's the same author. Otherwise, all these books written over that long of a period of time would not harmonize the way they do. Why can't we apply that more on a micro level with the Gospels themselves?
That's correct, and that's where I'm at on that, because even if you take out the concept of inspiration, even if you take that out, when you think about how the early church before Gospels would have functioned, so let's say Matthew and Mark 50 to 60 AD, right? Like we talked about. Let's even assume for a second Mark came first and it was written at 45. What are we doing from 30 AD to 45 AD? Everything is based upon oral tradition. We have inspired apostles who accompanied Jesus from the time of the baptism of John until the time of his ascension. And they are out there preaching what Jesus said, because Jesus was, they were there. And one of the practices of these rabbis that would go along is that you would have somebody there taking notes, writing down these traditions. And so someone says, see, there's Q right there. Well, not necessarily, because, and again, we'll get into this, there's really good reason not to believe in Q at all. And so even from a naturalistic perspective, we can see their information is coming from, very possibly, just a common source of oral tradition, and it's written down within 15 to 20 years from eyewitnesses. I mean, again, Mark and Luke are not eyewitnesses, but looking at historical context, they're dealing with eyewitnesses. At least Mark is, Peter, and Matthew. So it seems to make sense to me.
Well, I'm thinking about what Peter wrote in 2 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 13. He says, I think it right as long as I am in this body to stir you up by the way of reminder, since I know that the putting off of my body will be soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ made clear to me, and I will make every effort so that after my departure, you may be able at any time to recall these things.
Right.
What is that? How is he going to make that happen?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds to me like if he was using Mark to help record that gospel, that would be a surefire way to make it happen.
Surefire way to make it happen. And
especially if right after Jesus' ascension, he's not focusing on getting everything recorded, but doing the work that Jesus called him to do.
Right.
But towards the end of his life, he's like, I've got to make sure that there's a way for people for this stuff to carry on even after I'm gone. Mm-hmm. That date kind of matches up with that, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And when you look at the consistency of the events as they're recorded, seems to me that they did a pretty good job of making sure that happened, but it doesn't. But there's also so many differences, which we'll get into in a second, in just the writing style and the way that they operate. Because again, that was my big question. Like I said, was if Mark was written in, primitive Greek, and then you've got all these differences in writing style, how could they have copied each other? Because if Luke and Matthew are copying Mark, it should be the same street Greek,
right.
Or primitive Greek, but it's not. So how much of the copying is actually there? So here's what I found. The actual verbatim overlap. Now, what I mean verbatim, word for word. Because that's what I kept running into. The verbatim is huge. The amount of word for word copying is just astronomical.
And we're not talking about just individual words. Like if you were to compare what I'm saying in this podcast to you, we're both going to use the words "the." We're both using the words "and." We're talking about words being strung together.
Okay. And so my concept is, okay, how much is verbatim, and what do we mean by verbatim? How long is the thought?
Right. That's
verbatim.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are all the things I started to pick apart. Okay. So the actual verbatim overlap between the Synoptic Gospels. Now, remember what the numbers were. 90% of Mark is copied by Matthew, 50 to 65% is copied by Luke, and then Matthew and Luke have 20 to 25% copied from another source. The actual verbatim overlap between the Synoptic Gospels is around 8 to 12% of total words.
What happened to that other 30, 40, 50%?
Well, yeah. How about the 80 or 78 to...
I'm being generous.
Yeah.
I'm being generous. Now,
you are.
Something that kind of strikes me is kind of interesting here is that if they're also quoting Jesus, that 8 to 12%, how much is that are quotes of Christ?
That's the next question.
Okay.
So what I asked next was...
how many of that is from Jesus himself?
Well, no, my question was, how many of the verbatim, because they're dealing with the same events, right?
Right.
I asked the question, how much of the verbatim copying are quotes? Right.
Right. All right. So we were at 8 to 12.
So we have 8 to 12% of the Gospels.
So now at quotes, what is it now?
So now it's like, how much of that 8 to 12% are quotes of somebody?
Of either like an Old Testament or Jesus himself.
Jesus, whatever. A quote of a person.
Yeah.
90%. 90%. So 8 to 12% of the synoptics are verbatim, and 90% of the 8 to 12% are quotes.
And see, I mean, that other small percentage, that's really easy to explain. I mean, there's times when people will hang around my wife or my daughter and they'll say things that are similar to me or vice versa, right? I mean, given the fact that Matthew and Peter were both apostles, hanging around the same place, same time? I mean, do you think they might have adopted one another's language in some sense?
It's very possible.
I'm just thinking out loud, but I mean, I'm not bothered by that percentage at all.
Well, and the thing is, these aren't full sentences.
Okay.
Outside the quotes, they're not full sentences.
Okay.
What they are a phrase, a few words.
Right.
And again, it's really hard to actually get the verbatim number, but it's very small.
Sure.
So you sit back.
Would we call this an acceptable margin of error from the scientific community?
I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so. You mean from the 90% down to the 8 to 12?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying. So we get back to this whole concept here, and it is, you would expect, if you had these people listening to the same things, that they're going to get the quotes, especially if they're the quotes of Jesus.
Right.
That had been revered. I mean, this guy has been proven to them to be the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
You think that they're memorizing what Jesus said? Absolutely they are.
Yeah.
And again, now that we can bring in inspiration, if that such a thing does exist, the Spirit said, Jesus said, the Spirit's going to remind you of all the things that I did and I said. So of course they're going to be similar. Of course, a lot of them are going to be verbatim, because they get the big ones, the Lord's Prayer. It's very verbatim. Yeah. Okay. I mean, we could quote the Lord's Prayer because we've I was taught that as a Catholic, as a Methodist, all that stuff that I was.
do it in King James. I don't know. Everybody knows the Lord's Prayer in King James, but
yeah, they do. They do.
King James.
So to me, that makes it look like, okay, 90% is not accurate. And what they mean by that, of course, is, okay, same events, same structure. The phraseology is similar. And that's the thing that bugs me when they say you copied. They're stating, okay, because the phraseology is similar, you copied.
Yeah.
No. 3 eyewitnesses, of course. Matter of fact, if 3 eyewitnesses to a murder, if they all are saying the exact same thing in the exact same way, you're going to say, oh, they rehearsed this.
Mm-hmm.
They're covering for something.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're saying, okay, they copied off each other, but they're saying it in different ways. They're using different types of speech, but they're accurate in what they're hearing them say as far as the quotes.
Mm-hmm.
That actually adds authenticity.
It does.
It does. So, let's go. I'm going to open up to Luke chapter 4 for a second, because I just want to read what he has to say. Or Luke chapter 1. Sorry, I think I said Luke chapter 4. I meant Luke chapter 1. I want to read how Luke states what his gospel is, right? So again, we talked about last one that this is probably the most structurally beautiful Greek in the New Testament, right?
Makes sense, giving his credentials. Yeah.
Yep. So it says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those. Sorry, I'm going to get my glasses on. I was trying to make it without it, but that ain't going to work. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things which you have been taught. So when we take Luke here, for example, he's very clear. Many have sought before him to compile it. And I would think that if he's only talking about Matthew and Mark, he wouldn't use the word many.
He was talking about Q as well.
Yeah, maybe, right? Yeah. I guess the whole podcast is trash.
Right.
See, average. We shot too high, right? So Luke is very clear that others have gone before him, but that he wanted to create one in consecutive order for Theophilus about everything that happened so that he would know why he believed. And so he checked everything carefully, right? So this lets us know the concept behind it. It lets us know maybe there is some similarity between Matthew and Mark, because possibly he used them as things to just check to make sure.
Sure.
So
are the things that I found out, do they match up to what other people have already recorded?
And so someone might say, well, see, he copied. No, I don't believe he copied. But he does say, I looked at other sources.
That sounds just like verification to me.
It does sound like verification.
Verification.
And so, especially when you read what he says, and if you're looking at verbatim, there's not a ton of it.
No.
There's not a ton of it. So, we'll think about it this way. The three synoptics follow the same rough chronological outline. They have John the Baptist's ministry, Jesus' baptism, the calling of the disciples, the Galilean ministry, the journey toward Jerusalem, the last week of Jesus' life, including his death and resurrection. However, you have some of the parables and sermons that seem to be in different places. And to me, this has a very reasonable expectation or explanation. Did Jesus only ever present each message once?
I think not.
No, I mean, his website wasn't up yet. So you have to repeat these things.
I mean, we see preachers do that still today.
Yeah.
You know, I'm guilty of it. There's times when I've said the same story different times, and
Sure.
I'm pretty sure that, you know, the fish started out this big. No, but I mean, you know, just presenting it in a different way. So was Jesus good at tailoring his message a little bit with who he was talking to? Did he speak to the Pharisees differently than he was speaking to everyday Joe?
Oh, sure.
So if he's giving the same illustration, is he going to present it differently?
Sure, absolutely.
Right.
He's
So I
gonna
mean,
present it
I don't have a problem with that.
And even if Jesus presented the same message, he could present the same message in different locations, even around the same area, because not all the same people were surrounding him at all times.
Right.
You know, as he's traveling from Galilee down to Jerusalem, he's running into different people at different times, even possibly in the same day, in going over the same type of stuff. I mean, I know I preach at different locations each week, and there are times that I'll do different messages at those places. There's sometimes I'll do the same message at both places. And
I bet your wife is like, I know where he's going with this. I know where he's going with this.
Yeah, just repeats himself all the time.
I heard that literally this morning. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Ooh, pick me. Okay.
But some of the parables and the stories and the sermons are in different places. And the reason for that is Jesus was in front of different people and the message needed to get out there.
Right. And he did it more than once. That's
absolutely
perfectly logical explanation. We see it today. I don't know why.
It makes no sense.
Right.
Or sorry, it makes total sense.
Yeah,
it makes total sense. And think about what that would do for the disciples listening.
It would reinforce the things that they've heard.
Yes.
Certainly help with that memorization.
Absolutely it would. So plus what seems to be different many times, or what differences that are there, many times aren't when looked at as a whole, right? So again, we're going to do an entire episode on the supposed contradictions and the reliability of the Gospels, but that's going to come a little bit later.
I know the tomb's a big one, and that's one I'm looking forward to getting into. You know, because I know that's a big one.
It is, because different things are focused on in different places.
Exactly. So just to give people an example of what to anticipate, that would be an example we're probably going to go over, I suspect.
It is. And there's several of them, because you're looking at 3 different eyewitness accounts, and 4 with John, because then you get some of the same events that are talked about in there.
Clearly that John, it was really important for people to understand that he was faster than Peter, you know?
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
We're going to record this for all time. In a foot race, John could kill Peter.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Peter's like, oh man, what a jerk.
Yeah.
So going back to that concept of what Luke wrote in his prologue, you know, he investigated eyewitnesses to the things that Jesus said and did. And again, establishing the concept of the oral traditions that are later. But, you know, so without inspiration, we've got a reason why things are the way that they are. So examining the accounts before him would have been Matthew and Mark, possibly. You know, but you've got Paul. You take Paul, for example, in his gospel. If Luke is the gospel of Paul, it's remarkably similar. But there are a couple of different things that are emphasized there. But even Paul, you can see that he brings out brings out one thing specifically that none of the other folks did. You know, in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, he brings a quote that's only found of Jesus there. It's more blessed to give than to receive, right? We don't see that anywhere else, but Paul brings that out, and it's attributed to Christ. Now, this is the one that I find very interesting. Guess how many of the early church writers mention Q?
I'm going to say none of them did, because it's fairly recent. This hypothesis is a recent thing.
Yep. So
I would think none of them would.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So let's think about this. There's no manuscript evidence for it. 0. There's no historical reference
Except
to
for
it.
the manuscript that was created by people who say it existed.
Right. So no manuscript evidence, no historical evidence.
Uh-huh.
There's nothing that states that it
Right.
was real and existed. And the prologue of Luke is not hiding that others attempted to compile accounts. Now, think about this for a second. Why would he not state Q exists as part of his, if it was such an important document,
Mm-hmm.
why wouldn't he state that this is one of the things that I looked at?
Right.
And let's think about this. Since Luke's not an apostle, and if he's wanting to add authenticity to his gospel message, if he did copy off of Mark and Matthew, why wouldn't he have mentioned that? Here are two established gospels. One is more than likely Peter.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is another apostle, Matthew. Why wouldn't he state, by the way, I copied off of these guys? Now, I actually don't think that Luke possibly copied. I know I mentioned that he could have. I don't necessarily think that that's the case that he did.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, having Paul there would have been his, that would have been his main source. And I think that if he would have copied off of Mark and Matthew, that would have been a great place to say it.
Sure.
And that would have added authenticity to his gospel because these two were already accepted. Let's go ahead and throw that out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Luke's method actually contradicts the whole Q thing.
Right.
Because if Q existed and he copied off of it, he's not compiling or editing anything. He's just simply copying.
Sure.
And he's a big fat liar, and we shouldn't trust anything he has to say.
Right.
Right.
So the whole Q hypothesis, this is one of those things where in order for somebody's, their idea to have a foundation or basis, it has to exist. But
Yes.
we have absolutely no evidence of it whatsoever.
So you ready to get into some fun stuff?
I am. Was that not fun?
I think it was
Okay.
fun, but we'll see. We'll see how many views we get off of this. Right?
Okay.
Okay. So I want to talk about, we talk about this concept of higher criticism, right? Now, higher criticism, so there's two types of things. There's higher criticism and lower criticism. And you think, ooh, higher criticism, that's when you drink your tea with your pinky out. And lower criticism is, having like a glass of water or
Watching a football game and telling a quarterback he's a bum.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
it, yeah.
But lower criticism is textual criticism. So it's, okay, what are the actual physical manuscripts? What did these things actually say?
Mm-hmm.
And what they mean by lower criticism is it's if you picture criticism like a building, lower criticism is at the bottom. It's the foundational point.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean that it's lowbrow or something like that. Higher criticism really boils down to three areas. You have source criticism, which identifies early written sources. We've talked about the JEDP theory, how the Old Testament was compiled evolutionarily over, hundreds of years and then finally written down after the exile, or the Q source,
Mm-hmm.
right, that we just got done talking about. You have form criticism, which deals with oral traditions and genres before the text was written. And then you have something, and this is what we're going to spend a little bit of time on, something called redaction criticism. And this is the one, redaction criticism is how the editors that compiled the Bible edited the material for certain theological points to be made.
I mean, is this help to try to achieve harmony between them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And we're going to go into a few examples of this too. So redaction criticism is a subtle but influential arm of higher criticism. And it's essential that we understand this in regard to Q, because Q theory, like I said, would actually fall under source criticism,
Mm-hmm.
which we've just got done talking about. So I'm not going to spend.
We've already criticized that. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to talk about another layer
Okay.
of criticism. And the reason I think this one is important because scholars engage in this type of criticism all the time, and they make it seem like it's very objective when it's not. And this is one of the biases that I really want to point out for us, okay? So while textual criticism, which is lower criticism, asks this question, what did the original text say? Redaction criticism asks, how did later editors shape the material and why?
Yeah. This
Do you
kind of
see
goes
that
along
presupposition?
with yeah. I mean, it kind of comes to go with the reason why a lot of people don't accept Scripture is because they believe it's been changed over the years. The game
Yes.
of telephone, where it's what originally was and what we have now are two different things.
Two totally different things. And the reason is because the editors wanted to create a vision or a theology or a teaching that wasn't in the original. And like I said, you see this online all the time. You see it in books and whatever the case is, that, oh, they kicked books out of the Bible, right?
Right.
Because it didn't fit. Or, we don't have the autographs, so these things must have changed all
Right.
over the place. And,
Right.
the church added all kinds of doctrines to the text.
So it's a very popular mindset.
It's
It's something that we see quite often.
everywhere.
This is the name of it, but it's
Yes.
very popular. Yep. Most people would probably recognize it if they heard it.
Exactly. So it's called redaction criticism. And we have to understand the distinctions because while bias can come into the whole textual criticism, lower criticism, what did the original text actually say when looking at the manuscripts, it's really a lot more objective. Okay, what's this dated to? We can tell very clearly what these things are dated to. So there's not a lot of wiggle room with that kind of stuff. Now we can start saying, okay, was this source accurate? Those types of things. There is debate, don't get me wrong. But redaction criticism and higher criticism, all of higher criticism, is subject to a tremendous amount of bias and presupposition. Matter of fact, the presupposition and bias determine what your results are going to be. Because it's not based on objectivity.
Right.
It's based upon theory.
Right.
Hypothesis. So when a textual critic like Dr. Ehrman presents himself as acting in the capacity of a textual critic, but then is engaging in higher criticism, specifically redaction criticism, where bias determines everything, it can be disingenuous and misleading.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you believe it? What? So think about.
You mean bias can be misleading? What?
It can. There's a difference between these two statements. I'm going to read two different statements.
All right.
There are variants in the manuscripts.
Okay.
That's an objective fact.
Sure. We can read that in our own Bibles. Like when you
Yes.
go to Acts chapter 8 and verse 37, they say is left out of some manuscripts. So,
Yes.
I understand that.
It's an
But that's
object-
not being hidden. That's
No.
not being hidden.
and it's not subject to bias. As a matter of fact, the bias a lot of times is typically on the other side of the more conservative Christian side, where they say, this Bible I have has no variants in it.
Right.
No, it absolutely does.
Right.
It absolutely does. Right. So if Bart Ehrman states that, or any textual critic states that, that's an objective fact. But then if they follow up and say something like this, and this is something that I've heard a lot of quote unquote textual critics and scholars say, the resurrection was a later invention by the church. And so if a textual critic is saying that and they say, see, there's variants in the manuscript, and we see that the resurrection was a later invention by the church, they think, oh, because there's objective evidence for the variants, there must be objective evidence that the resurrection was a later invention too.
That's kind of a leap there.
Well, and it's wrong.
Right.
It's wrong because when you
You're just assuming what's been added and what hasn't been added. And one of the biggest
Right.
parts is what you're assuming has been added. So that's kind of a leap.
It's a huge leap. So when we have someone moving from textual criticism to redaction criticism, which is not based on objectivity,
Right.
which is based on bias and presupposition, and you're not telling your audience that, hey, I'm moving from something objective to subjective.
They take it as fact.
They take it as fact.
Right.
They take it as fact.
Yeah.
The resurrection was not a later invention. It was included all the way from the beginning. We have the Old Testament prophecies that prophesied that the resurrection was going to take place. Right? So these things are not later inventions whatsoever.
So then they would actually say that later inventions would be parts of the gospel where Jesus talks about the resurrection. Wouldn't it? Wouldn't they say that was we added that stuff later
absolutely.
as well? Okay.
So, for example, a lot of the earlier manuscripts show that Mark ends in Mark 16:8.
Right.
And so they say, see, all the resurrection stuff is gone. But before Mark 16:8, we have the resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
So it's just not explained. And again, our guest that we're going to have, James Snap, is going to talk to us about the epilogue to Mark 16 after verse 8. It very much has a lot of proof to
So
it.
they're saying the Great Commission has been added later. You
Yeah.
don't have to follow the Great Commission. The resurrection, yeah, that happened. But does Jesus want us to do with anything with it? No, that was added.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, look, honestly, personally, I think you agree. It'd be great if that serpent handling stuff wasn't in there because it gets so twisted,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
but it was. So let's
I
just
think
go
that's
ahead
part
and
of the
deal
weeding process. Christ knew what he was doing.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Anybody who takes this literally, or as
it's like, okay, we're going to engage in spiritual survival of the fittest here that actually bleeds over into physical. It's like, go ahead, do it. See what happens.
I don't need you guys preaching the gospel anyway.
right, exactly.
Kentucky pastor is dead after a snake bites him.
So those 2 points, the manuscripts have, or variants in the manuscripts, the resurrection was a later invention by the church, 1 and 2. They think number 2 is the same objective authority as number 1, which absolutely is not the case. Yet he and many others slip in and out of these different categories all the time without emphasizing that or at least acknowledging it.
Right.
And so the folks that are ignorant, and I don't mean ignorant in a bad way, there's a lot of things that I'm ignorant of, but people who might be ignorant of textual criticism or ignorant of how higher criticism and lower criticism works, they're clueless to this, and they think this has absolute objective authority
They're
behind
take it
it.
as proven fact, not as somebody's opinion.
And if you were to ask Dr. Ehrman, hey, do you have proof for this? He'd say, oh, yeah, there's all kinds of, but there isn't any.
Right.
And I'm not saying Ehrman would say that, but what I'm saying is they think that if they were to ask Ehrman that there would be all kinds of objective, he would say, ooh, this manuscript, that manuscript, this teaching, that teaching. No, from the beginning, the resurrection was always there. That's why in the Gospels it states, hey, they in Matthew, they stole the body.
Yeah.
Right? They stole the body because they got to explain it. Right? So redaction criticism mainly has an anti-supernatural bias because they say these are editors that edited the text for a certain theological bent. And we're going to go into a couple of examples here. So they soften the passages that deals with Jesus' anger and the disciples' failure. So, for example, let's look at this. I'm going to go to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1 and verse 41, where he states, let's go to 40. He says, and a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him and saying, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing, be cleansed. So an editor would have been, in some manuscripts, that word for compassion is actually anger in some manuscripts.
Okay.
And so they say, see, he edited it out. And in Matthew 8:3 and Luke 5:13, it actually omits any emotional reference whatsoever to this and just replaces it with compassion.
Okay.
So, Jesus, when you look at the Gospel of Mark, he is definitely, like we talked about it yesterday, he's definitely very abrupt.
Sure.
And a little bit rough with them.
Sure. Pretty straightforward.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so later on, he, in some of the other Gospels, that's not there. So they say, so the redaction criticism guys say, oh, well, Matthew and Luke, they saw that Jesus wasn't portrayed so well, so they softened it.
Gotcha.
It's just the difference in the style of the books.
It is.
Right? And let's just ask a question. Have you ever felt different emotions at the same time?
Sure. Feeling them right now. No.
It's like I can't believe I was spending my afternoon at family camp doing this, right? And yeah, I mean, we even talk about how we're torn.
Sure.
That sometimes I'm excited, but I'm nervous, or there's times where I'm moved with compassion, but I'm also angry.
Mm-hmm.
Because especially if the event that I'm having compassion over was caused by somebody's negligence. Yeah. So you can have compassion and anger at the exact same time.
Absolutely.
And so just because one gospel highlights something, couldn't that just be God saying, I want to bring the complexity of the situation to light? Mm-hmm. It just makes sense that way.
I think so.
Right? Another aspect is in the Gospels, like in Mark, and this is how some textual critics like to play it. It's like, oh, this is a secret. Don't tell anybody I'm the Messiah. Shh, we're not going to tell anybody. In Matthew and Luke, do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the Gospel of John, he's like, hey guys, I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was born, I am.
Well, to me, and again, without looking ahead here, it sounds like that would just be talking about two different instances. The time when he's not ready to let people know that he's the Messiah versus the time when he is ready to let people widely know that he's the Messiah.
Well, yeah, and it's different audiences.
Sure.
Too. Because Jesus' proclamation as Messiah, he didn't necessarily want it out all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at who he really revealed it to, yes, in John 4, he really revealed it to the woman at the well.
Mm-hmm.
Sure did. That's Samaria.
Right. Who's going to believe her anyway?
Right, exactly. And Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. So that's going to stay pretty well confined.
Right.
Right. And when you see him doing it with the Pharisees and with the chief priests and the Sadducees, he's doing it to stoke their anger to make sure he gets crucified.
Right. Right.
Right. So Jesus had a mission that he had to accomplish. He needed to be crucified on the Passover 3.5 years after he started his ministry. That had to happen. And so he's not necessarily orchestrating events, but he's in his preaching, he's doing things to move towards that direction.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we see people, they're not really taking in all the complex characteristics of an individual. Not just
Right.
Jesus, but they're looking at these isolated incidents and saying, see, when you compare this to this, there's obviously contradiction here, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's what a lot of people do with the Old Testament and the New Testament. Think of the old God as being one way and Jesus in the New Testament being a different way. And they say, see, we're seeing a contradiction. It can't be the same God. We've talked
Right.
about that in the podcast.
Right.
So what we're not really doing is we're not investigating the complexity of an individual, and they might be experiencing different things at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter, she plays homeschool basketball, and she was thinking about changing to another team. We were excited for her, but turns out that would cause a rift with the other family members who really like her playing with their kids. So we're excited for Maya on one side, but at the same time, we're also sad for some of these other families who might be disappointed. Same emotion, same situation at the exact same time. That's the complexity of human life, and we know that Christ was human. So we're just really, I think these critics are really just not giving the complexity of the human condition as much credit as they should.
So Maya's taking her talents to South Beach?
I wish, no. But you see what I'm saying? I mean, they're just looking at it on paper, and they're not really thinking about the complexity of a human. Or of a person.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And so, what we have here is you're dealing with a very complex time. So many different variables.
How about a complex situation?
And
Jesus is trying to, show everybody God. He's trying to, promote eternal life. But at the same, he's trying to get people to believe in him and love him and want to follow him. But at the same time, he's also trying to get people at one time to kill him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a hard situation. I got to get people to love me and people to kill me at the same time.
Yeah. And so when he's telling people not to say anything, it's to the crowds.
Right.
But when he's revealing himself, it's to the people who are in control of his fate.
Right. Right.
And we know that they are in control because Jesus even lets Pilate know, you would have no authority unless it was given to you from on high. So you can't really dismiss that. He is saying Pilate has authority, but that it was given to him from on high.
Right.
But he says these other guys have a greater sin than you because they're the ones that delivered me up to you.
Right. So, I mean, what I'm seeing here is I'm really seeing some straw man arguments,
That's it. And that's the whole point of what I'm trying to bring across here is because people think that these Q arguments are insurmountable. All these scholars believe it, but it's all based on something false. And when you get into the actual arguments that they make, there's no, especially when they're dealing in redaction criticism or source criticism, there's no substance to them.
Right.
Because we can go ahead. It was like last time when we were talking about the arguments that Ehrman was using against Paul, and he says, the biggest thing in the clip, the biggest thing are the theological arguments. We looked at those and we're like, there's no theological argument here.
No, there's not.
There's 100% consistency.
Right, because he was looking
between
at
these
contradictions, and when we actually investigated, we're like, well, this looks a lot. These things that he's debating, they look very similar to some of these letters by Paul that are not debated,
not contested,
and they're harmonious,
right? And I think we dealt with like 20 some odd of them,
and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
And that was just that was a high level view.
Yeah.
Right. So we have softening the difficult passage, what they say he does, and then they say they're evolving theology to a more complex state. So they say, okay, well, Mark's theology is less complex, and Matthew's is definitely more complex, and Luke says even more, and John's, forget about John. His is a whole lot more complex. They're different.
Yeah.
They're
That's all
different.
it is. They're just different.
Right. But when you're looking, if you were to look at this from their perspective, if you have their bias, naturalistic bias, that's the assumption you're going to come to. Because again, those biases guarantee an anti-supernatural conclusion. Right. And then trying to fix errors or contradictions through a deliberate harmonization. Man, if they did that, then they did a really bad job, because we still have the perspectives of the eyewitnesses. Like for example, in Mark and Luke, they mention one demon. We're talking about the Gadarene demoniac. They mention one person possessed. In Matthew, it's two people that are possessed. Right? Same event. So people are like, see, contradiction. Well, if they're trying to hammer out the contradictions, Matthew did a really bad job.
Right.
He didn't get the memo. He didn't understand the assignment. Right. But so when I came across that one, I'm like, okay, let me look at this. And so you read Matthew, and his version is very abbreviated. You read Mark and you read Luke. What happens there is they then focus on the one man who had the most demon, the legion guy, and he's then clothed in his right mind, and they focus on him. So from their perspectives, there's only one guy we're focusing on.
Yeah.
And so it's not hard but if you go looking for a problem, you're going to find it.
Right.
But if you're going to looking at it and say, okay, is there a reasonable, logical explanation as to why Matthew has two and Mark and Luke have one? Absolutely there is, because Matthew doesn't go into that whole backstory and afterstory of what happened.
Right.
It ends with the villagers coming out with pitchforks saying, get out of here. Right? After their pigs fly off the cliff.
Right.
But Matthew or Mark and Luke are like, let's dive into this guy more individually. And they're going to highlight him, because the other guy, obviously, that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
people just kind of zone in on the things that they want, like you said, if they want to find a problem. It kind of makes me think of what Mark chapter 16, verse 16. That's a pretty big one, where Christ says, if you believe and baptize, you'll be saved. Those who don't believe will not be saved. So many people discredit baptism because they say, look, in the second half of that verse, Jesus doesn't say that if you're not baptized, you won't be saved. And the thing I always point out to them is like, well, what is it that you're focusing on? You're focusing on what Jesus says to do not to be saved, rather than what Jesus says you need to do to be saved. Yeah. Where's our focus here? What are we focusing on?
Do you want to know how to be saved or be condemned?
Right. What are we focusing on?
Yeah.
So like you said, if people are looking for a problem, they're going to find it.
So the synoptic problem is largely framed. Is largely framed.
It is inflamed.
It is inflamed. Yeah. They should go to the doctor for that. Largely framed within this redaction critical type of framework, but also the source material, source criticism. And the dominant academic assumptions are this: the writers of the gospel were not eyewitnesses, not written by who they said they were written by. The text reflects early church theology, not historicity of events. The variants are signs of theological redaction, editing, not harmonious diversity. So, again, the reason I'm bringing this up, I just want to highlight more of the presuppositions and recognize that when a textual critic goes from objective textual criticism into very subjective redaction criticism or source criticism,
it's not proven fact.
They're not using the same level of evidence. Right. And so if nobody gets anything else out of these podcasts that we're doing on this kind of stuff, the one thing I hope they get out of it is, let's examine the amount of evidence and what type of evidence this is, and what are the presuppositions and biases going into it. Right.
Same thing we've always been saying is, like, when someone makes a claim, investigate the claim. Don't just take their word for it.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't care how many letters they have after their name.
Sure.
Right. So here's the bottom line: the synoptic problem is real. It's there, and there's things that we have to deal with it. But it's not a problem for the believer who approaches the scriptures with both faith and clarity and objectivity.
Problem seems like a strong word to me.
Yeah.
It's something that needs to be investigated. But again, problem seems like a strong word to me.
The synoptic question.
Right. Sure. I would take that.
Yeah. So we've seen how assumptions shape conclusions. Methods like redaction criticism can offer some helpful observations, but they carry a lot of theological baggage, naturalistic biases that rule out supernatural from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. It's that classic thing where if you're trying to explain something spiritual when you're looking at it through a physical lens, obviously you're going to be missing some things.
You absolutely are.
Right.
Now, our job isn't to fear these conversations, but to shine a light on them, which is, I think, what we're trying to do here is just pull the curtain back a little bit and say, let's ask some other questions as we go through here. Let's be discerning. Let's be honest about presuppositions. And most of all, I hope throughout all of these things, I know it's doing this with me and hopefully it's doing this with you. I think it is. Let's stay grounded in the confidence that Scripture is both historically rooted and divinely inspired. And again, when we get it more into the prophecies, that's going to be that's where my proof lies. That's where your proof lies, and we want to really hit on those things because, we first wanted to talk about what books belong in the Bible. Then we're going to talk about, okay, can we be confident that what's written down now is what was written down originally? And now let's actually get into the text itself and examine these types of things. And the bottom line is we don't need to be afraid of academic conversations. We don't need to be afraid to pursue these things intellectually and to take them head on and examine these things clearly.
Not only should we not be afraid, we should be encouraged to do it. One thing that I've really learned, and growing up, when you would ask difficult questions about Scripture and about God and the spiritual, a lot of people would their go-to response is, you just need to have faith. You just need to have faith. One thing that I've begun to appreciate, not just since becoming a Christian, but since we started this podcast, is sometimes you just got to have faith. And I get it. Sometimes you do, but that can also be a lazy approach sometimes.
It can be.
It can be. Because, does God give us reason to believe the things that we believe? Right. Yes, but is some searching required on our part?
Yeah.
So sometimes just have faith. That can sometimes be a lazy approach. We can look into these things, and we should look into these things.
Isn't it just easier to just not look into this? These things are hard.
It is. It is easier, which is why I say I think it's a little bit of a lazy approach.
That's what I'm saying. These things take a lot of energy and effort to look into, and it can be easy to get confused on them.
Right.
Right. And people can run up against a brick wall and they say, oh, that doesn't look good. I need to stop because if I go too much further, I'm going to get into something that I can't handle or it's going to cause me to question too much. No, that's when we lean on each other. That's one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. But we need to push. We need to ask the right questions. But we need to be awake. We can't engage in these things. And you mentioned being lazy, not engaging in them. I think you can engage in them as well in a lazy fashion.
Sure.
Right. So let's not engage in these things in a lazy way. If we're going to open this door, let's be diligent in going through it and examining it properly and not just stopping when we find what we agree with or what we've always wanted to agree with.
Right.
That does nobody.
Then we're no better than the critics.
Right.
For combating. Right. Okay. Well, Matt, I really appreciate you addressing this. And do we already know what we're going to be talking about next episode?
We are getting into the epistles of John. So we're going to talk about the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that and really appreciate everybody being here for the recording at Virginia Family Camp. And until next time, with Cat CPR, I'm Jeremiah.
And I'm Matt.
And the cat may have killed you. No, wait, sorry.
What?
Yeah, the cat killed you.
The cat killed you.
But you don't have to kill the cat. No. Curiosity may have killed the cat.
No, but hey, hold on a second.
Curiosity. Sorry.
If the cat killed you, you should be avenged. Right?
We got to perform CPR on you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So curiosity may have killed the cat.
But it doesn't have to kill you.
That was the smoothest yet. See you next time.